that they were central, they were celebrated in their own time. So if anything, they deserve to be more celebrated now.
I love that you kind of got a nice spectrum as well, like a poet, a warrior, and an athlete. You know, it's kind of
they were doing everything.
Should Fulvia be a household name like Cleopatra? What about the Cimmerian poetess, the very first known writer? Or the wealthy Spartan princess, who was the first woman to win at the Olympic Games? Today's Classical Wisdom Speaks podcast episode is with Dr. Daisy Dunn, an award-winning classicist and author of 7 books. She's the editor of Argo, a Hellenic review, an international journal of Greek culture published by the Hellenic Society, and has written for several publications, including the Sunday Times, the Daily Telegraph, Literary Review, the New Statesman, Newsweek, among others. Today we discuss her latest book, The Missing Thread, a new history of the ancient world through the women who shaped it. So Daisy, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me and talk about your latest book, The Missing Thread, a new history of the ancient world through the women who shaped it. And it's just really beautifully interwoven, and it did a really great job of sort of highlighting all these different women while kind of going through the history. But I love the imagery of weaving and the missing thread. And, you know, that was obviously like a theme for the book. But of all the objects and activities that kind of come in the realm of women historically, why did you choose weaving?
Well, actually, so the idea of the missing thread and weaving came to me sort of after I started writing, because I think conventionally you come up with a title for your book before you start researching and writing it. But in this case, I found that so many of the words relating to women and antiquity had actually already been taken by other books. And I was just searching around thinking, oh my goodness, I can't call it femina. I can't call it. There were so many sort of different words. And it's crazy how many were already missing. So I sat down and I was thinking about this, and I realized that weaving really was the sort of the main occupation for a lot of women in antiquity, all the way from Homer through to the court of Augustus in Rome. But while I was crafting the book, I realized more and more that I felt like a weaver myself. I was weaving together all of this material across quite a wide time span and making what seemed to be like a giant tapestry in myself. And I realized increasingly that women's contribution to this history was really what was missing from existing histories of the ancient world. So the idea of the missing thread and weaving really seemed to fit.
Well, I love that. Like the action of bringing out the story is like the action in of itself. And I think, I mean, of course, Penelope is sort of the most famous character from mythology, and like kind of the foundation of so much of all of ancient Greece and Roman culture. And she's so interwoven with the weaving that, and she's like the archetype from the rest of history. So I think it's a fantastic place to start, and maybe not so intuitively for people who aren't as spending as much time in the classics as some of us are. So I think it was very effective. But I thought, just considering that there is so much less information about women historically, like how do we go about constructing the historical narrative that can focus on them? Because there's so many history books that just leave them out, as you say, like they're the missing thread.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, comparatively little writing actually exists by women, which is the first problem from the ancient world. And in the historical sources themselves, the emphasis 9 times out of 10 is on the lives and the actions of men. But I found that if you start to look really closely, you find snippets here and there, which gradually add up to build a bigger picture. So what I had to do was to go right the way back to the very beginning and reread every historical source that I'd ever looked at before, with an eye to finding the women in those sources, because I think it's really easy to overlook them. They're there. You have to actually be looking for them to find them. And it's true that certain women certainly get a lot of attention in the sources. So Aspasia in Greece, for example, or Livia in Rome. But I didn't want to focus purely on these better documented women, these women that we maybe talk about more today. I was seeking to write a history not sort of through the lives of 10 well-known women, say, but rather rewrite the complete history by tracing women through events all the way through a 3,000-year period. And you can only really do that by immersing yourself in the primary sources. And I mean, not just the written sources either. I mean, the epigraphical, the inscriptions, the artistic, the archaeological, everything. And really trying to find those women, pinpoint them to tell the bigger story.
Were there some sources that were just gold mines that you didn't anticipate? And you're like, oh, wow, oh, why didn't I look here in the first place?
I think Herodotus surprised me. I hadn't realized quite how many women were in Herodotus and sort of were intrinsic to events and sort of the creation of sort of court societies, the sort of shaping the way that the narrative progressed. In Thucydides, by contrast, we find quite a paucity of women. You struggle to find many women there. So Herodotus surprised me. Tacitus, I guess, used to think about sort of the focus on being on the Roman emperors, but actually a lot of women are there, and they're not just behind the scenes either. They're really, really important. So I was perennially surprised. I think that's sort of the great pleasure of taking on such a big period and sort of taking on this project, was actually finding them in these sources, which I'd read so many times and I thought I knew inside out. And then I realized, oh my gosh, I completely missed this woman. So it was actually great fun.
I feel like it's so comforting in a way to know that there is so much information that still exists out there where, you know, women or people from diverse backgrounds are prominent and just people haven't noticed as much, you know, but it is there still. And we have lost so much information from the ancient world that there has been these gems that have survived, and you go, oh, wow, okay, this can open our eyes if we're just looking for it. So I feel like it's very thrilling, you know, you're like, oh, good, there's still hope, there's still information to find. But another thing I noticed in the book is that, you know, there's a lot of myth in the history, and it's something that, you know, I regularly bring up, and I think it's kind of inevitable when you're talking about the ancient world, is how can we separate the history and the myth? And there's so many times where we find out the myth turns out to be history, and so many times it's the other way around. And so, you know, how can we distinguish? How did you distinguish between the two while kind of going through the history through women's eyes?
That's a really interesting question. I think I'm a writer first and foremost, writing for a general rather than an academic readership. And as such, I'm always aware that myth is quite often the first thing that people encounter about the ancient world. It's their first contact with the antiquity. If you haven't studied classics, you might still have come across a myth as a child. You might be familiar with Echo and Narcissus, or the Trojan horse, or the Cyclops, or something like that. And I think in the ancient world, myth was equally or more ubiquitous. It formed part of everyday conversation. It informed foundation stories. It was parable. And although it's rarely historical, there are moments where history and myth actually touch. So if you think, for example, of the Golden Fleece, that myth is probably inspired by the history of people actually panning for gold in the region of modern Georgia. I say in the book as well, the myth of the Amazons, these great brave warrior women, was likely informed by the Scythian tribes who ranged the Eurasian steppe. And I think as a writer, I find it really powerful to utilize our familiarity with some of those stories in order to lead the reader into the realm of history. So, for example, particularly with the Mycenaeans, they were early Greek Bronze Age people. They're monumental builders, and their architecture and their way of life really helped inform Homer's description, particularly in the Iliad. He was setting his epics about 400 years before his own time. So when I was writing my chapter on the Mycenaeans, I accessed some of their architecture, some of their gateways through the myth. It was a way of sort of bringing that world alive for the reader when actually sort of the information, so the written record's quite poor. And I think as a writer, you can really clearly signpost what's myth, what's literary, what's real. What I find particularly exciting is when the two are intentionally blurred, by ancient authors. So they render it very, very difficult for us to separate myth from reality. They wanted to glorify passages in their past, and so they'd interpret, say, for the Mycenaeans, a huge wall as the handiwork of a cyclops, for example. In that case, it's obviously quite easy for us to distinguish myth from reality, but really judgment is the thing that's important at all times. I think you're very aware as a historian that a lot of the time when people are writing about women in particular, their presentation of the facts is often quite biased, particularly when it comes to female morality. So historical judgment is really key, and that judgment is something you develop over time. You develop it from experience, from exposure to the sources. I mean, I've been studying classics for a long time. This book probably contains the fruit of about 15 years of research, and I think my judgment on certain points will differ from that of other historians, but I'm totally okay with that. I feel like we need to disagree. I think that's healthy. I think from experience, you form more confidence in your conviction and in your handling of the material and the way that you distinguish myth from reality. And I think that's really what helps you in the long run.
Well, and I think that's why it's so important to encourage future generations of historians and classicists who are capable and fascinated to go to the primary sources, to learn the ancient Greek and because every generation will interpret or read these original texts differently, but depending, I mean, think of Sappho and Victorian age, they're like, oh, well, that's kind of awkward. Let's just change the pronouns. You're like, well, that's not true to the actual words and to the text. And another thing I think is great with the myths is they reflect the priorities or the values of a culture. So the fact that the ancient Greeks loved the myths of the Amazons tells you something about what they held important in the warrior culture or what fascinated their imagination. I mean, just from a historical standpoint, that's quite a revelation as well, that you get to kind of see what they were interested in. I don't know what future generations are going to think of us. They're going to like, but they were obsessed with Batman or things like that. We might not.
I think that would be preferable to us being sort of simply obsessed with social media. I think that would be kind of
okay. Let's go back to Batman.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask. You said, okay, the men at different times, the historians have not recorded the women. Was it a lot of times in that moment, like in the ancient time periods, they didn't record it? Or were they just not replicated, during the medieval time period or during the Victorian age? Like, who's at fault?
It's a real mixture. I mean, I kind of feel that women are left out of ancient accounts a lot, and when they're put in, it's because there's just something vaguely kind of titillating or interesting about them. So then when you get the sort of serious historians writing in, the 18th, 19th centuries, they leave that out as kind of tittle tattle, and it's not serious history. What are these women doing? And we don't need them in our events. So they kind of perpetuate and they actually make it worse. And the more times that a version of events is told, it becomes canonical, and women just don't find their place. So this is why it's so important always to go back to the primary source. This is where I begin with every book. You go back to the beginning, see what other people might have missed. I think there's a real risk if you're reading purely secondary literature that you're going to just overlook these women and just perpetuate the same errors, the same omissions. And you don't want Cato to win in this case. I mean, he comes across as just such an awful person, particularly in that debate, the way he's describing the women, saying if men were doing their jobs, at home and keeping their women in check, we wouldn't be having this problem in public. Why do the women just not raise this with their husbands in the privacy of the home? Why do they have to bring this into the public arena? They're absolutely outraged when they see women massing, in the forums or the crowd beyond. What are they doing? He's absolutely furious about this. So to me, like, I'm furious. I don't want him to get his way. Why should women be shut up? You want these women to protest. And I mean, I think there's a sort of vein of protest that runs through this book, me trying to sort of say these women need to be remembered. Their part in all of history needs to be remembered. I was less interested in writing about sort of the lives of women. There are many, many sort of brilliant books about sort of Roman women's lives, for example, Greek women's lives. I wanted to see particularly what role they played in this history that we kind of consider canonical. I wanted to draw out those particular contributions to the historical narrative.
Well, and exactly to your point, I mean, an example, for instance, is Cleopatra. Obviously, there's tons and tons of books, or at least different versions. I mean, I realize that's also controversial. Sometimes she's depicted in various different ways. But people talk a lot less about Fulvia, and she is very critical. I mean, extremely critical at times. Why, why do you think she wasn't given the limelight? Did she just have less sex appeal?
I mean, this is one of the great mysteries. I think Fulvia is one of the most extraordinary women of the ancient world, and she deserves to be a household name today just as much as Cleopatra. I mean, she was married to Mark Antony at the time that he was pursuing his affair with Cleopatra. And in spite of his infidelity, she worked incredibly hard for him to champion him, sort of in relation to Octavian, future Emperor Augustus. I mean, so much so she actually fought a war on his behalf. And I say in the introduction to the book, I sort of read about this war, the Perusine War, sort of 4140 BC in modern Perugia and Italy. I'd read about it with a certain sense of incredulity, thinking, could this really be right? Could this woman really have been fighting a war, this sort of great siege that's described in the literary accounts? And I hadn't actually until then come across the archaeological evidence for her part in this, particularly these lead bullets, these slingshots, which are inscribed with the most crude graffiti imaginable, some of it actually naming her. And one of the bullets says, "I'm aiming for Fulvia's clitoris." And Landica is not a word you come across that often in Latin, right? I mean, it's quite sort of, it's explicit, it's very direct. Unfortunately, this war didn't go in Fulvia's direction. It was Octavian's forces who won that siege. And Antony seems to have been not remotely thankful to Fulvia for her part while he was in the East for doing this. But she's extraordinary for other reasons beside that. I mean, she was married early. Her first husband was Publius Clodius Pulcher, the great demagogue of Rome. They seem to have had a very close relationship. They're said in the sources to have been inseparable. They had 2 children together. When he was killed in the brawl with Milo, she was the one who opened the doors so that the Roman people could actually see his stabbed corpse, and she kind of helped stir up the passion of the crowd. She was extremely brave. She was politically active. But I think when you look at the historical sources, male historians repeatedly describe her as a meddler in affairs. They blame her for the breakdown in relations between members of the Second Triumvirate. This alliance between Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus. She
She's like the
is
ancient
seen
Yoko Ono, basically.
basically everything is blamed on her, and sort of seen that, once she's dead and out the way, clearly the relations between these 3 men are just going to be rosy. Everything's going to be better. I mean, history showed us otherwise. This broke down. She is not the problem in this relationship as they described, but the historians didn't even have the sort of decency to say, okay, we were wrong on that front. It wasn't all Fulvia's fault after all. There were cracks in this relationship from the beginning. It was dangling by a thread. Fulvia just kind of bears the blame. And in my book, what I've tried to do is to refocus the lens back on Fulvia, slightly away from Cleopatra. Not that Cleopatra is insignificant. Clearly, she's very, very significant in her own right. But I think there are many, many books that have been dedicated to her. But at Fulvia's expense, really, I think Fulvia deserves to be better known. Her role in the life of Mark Antony, her relationship with the Second Triumvirate, her sort of broader role within the late Republic needs to be recognized today. She needs to be a household name.
And I'm all for that. Like, go Team Fulvia. But no, I mean, I just think every time we look at another corner, another angle, we're adding to the truth of the history and understanding it more. And like that should be the goal, like getting as full of a picture as possible. So by picking out different people who haven't really been looked at carefully and understanding them better, we're just adding to our collective knowledge, which surely is, what we're after. So to that end, could you maybe tell us 1 or 2 more ancient women that you think deserve a little bit more of the limelight?
Oh goodness, yeah. I mean, I'm so horribly aware of how many women have even remained nameless to us in the sources. They have this kind of collective contribution, which I kind of really wanted to draw out. I also driven to write this book, partly in order to champion them. But as you say, there are also remarkable individuals who we know a fair amount about, but they're not so well known today. So I loved reading some of the hymns of Enheduanna, for example. She is the earliest named author in the world. Isn't that extraordinary? Why is her name not better known? She is a Sumerian poet. She's living in the 3rd millennium BC, so very, very early. Her father was a king of Akkad, which is a region that some today identify with modern Baghdad. She was a high priestess to a moon deity named Nana. And she wrote these extraordinary hymns. And in one of them, really quite devastatingly, she describes her sexual assault by an enemy of her father who wanted to seize power for himself. It's a really extraordinary moment in this hymn. And again, it traverses time. I mean, the centuries really fall away as you describe the fact that she says like her voice, her ability to lift people's spirits actually turned to dust in the wake of that assault. I mean, it is so timeless. So I really encourage people to go back and sort of rediscover Enheduanna and look at some of her work. On a completely different scale, but looking again on poetry, Telesilla is a woman who really surprised me. She was a poet who came from Argos in the Peloponnese. She lived in the 5th century BC, and she actually turned to writing poetry when she herself was suffering. It was on the advice of the Pythia of Delphi. She was unwell, and the priestess said to her, poetry she essentially thought it would be a great outlet. It would be kind of almost a healing thing for you to do. And she achieved praise for her poetry, but she also helped to lead the defense of her city, which was remarkable. It was a sort of Spartan invasion. Again, the sources are slightly difficult on this. It's difficult to know exactly how far to believe them. Did she really completely halt the Spartan invasion? Probably not, but she was celebrated for playing a part in the defense of her city, defending the city walls, at least. Siniska, another woman who springs to mind, she was the earliest female victor in the male Olympic Games, and she became a victor by virtue of of owning the winning horses in 2 consecutive Olympic Games. Because again, one of the oddities of the ancient world, we often forget that it wasn't the jockeys who won the prizes in equestrian events, it was the owner of the horses. So she, like Siniska, actually got a statue dedicated to her by virtue of that. So these remarkable women who were actually recognized in their own time. I mean, having public monuments to women wasn't all that common, but it did happen. And it's a shame we don't have, for the most part, we occasionally get a statue base, but it's rare that we actually have the full statue. So I think that's why some of these women have vanished from our line of sight, quite literally, and why we need to sort of look at the literary sources and draw them back out of the accounts and remember what they were doing, remember that they were essential, they were celebrating their own time. So if anything, they deserve to be more celebrated now.
I love that you kind of got a nice spectrum as well, like a poet, a warrior, and an athlete. It's kind of
they were doing everything.
Well, and it's interesting too, because you think of like what men hold as high regard, and they're the ones who kind of made the history books. So maybe it's not that shocking that, they're the ones who got written about as well. But Daisy, okay, I know you've been very generous with your time. So I've got one more question for you, and it's not an easy one. But how does focusing on women in history reveal history itself? Like what revelations can we glean by kind of taking this new angle?
A really interesting question. I mean, I think the first thing I'd say is that it shows that women have always been there. And that sounds a really obvious thing to say, but they are ever present. They're in places where you wouldn't even think to look. They're in the Persian camp of Darius during his conflict with Alexander the Great. They're on the ships that Xerxes mans during the Greco-Persian Wars. In the case of Agrippina the Elder, just to pluck a woman at random, they're on the front line of the Roman army on the Rhine in Germany during the Germanic Wars. And she's there, she's preventing the men from making this terrible military mistake. She's helping to stem a political uprising, a rebellion in the wake of Augustus's death. So I think the problem is that we learn the same versions of history. Those versions of history tend to be repeated. And this is often at the expense of women. And I think in order to truly understand this, we need this approach. We need to look at women and understand that they're not purely on the sidelines. Um, they're not just in the background being obedient to men's whims. They were active and they were proactive as well. They wrote, they strategized, they protested, and they really lived. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. And I think we should really admire them for that and give them credit. You know, when we're looking at history, we really need to put their roles on a par with those of men. And I'm really passionate about that.
I love that. I think that's so beautiful. And I think it's great for the next generation of kids and women and boys and girls to like know that in history there are these powerful women to appreciate that. So I think I really enjoyed your book, and I'll put a link down below for everybody so they can check out The Missing Thread, a new history of the ancient world through the women who shaped it. And I just want to say thank you so much for talking to me today.
Oh, thank you. These are great questions. It's really great to actually think about your book once you've written it. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds.